Century American Art. I'm Jan Herndon, a docent at the Polk Museum of Art in Lakeland and a teacher of art history, and I'll be your guide once again for this final chapter in this series. Today's topic as we finish up the century, Impressionism. But this is not exactly the Impressionism of Monet, Renoir, and Degas. Impressionism on this side of the Atlantic will have a decidedly American flavor. But first, let's once again set the stage historically. During the post-Civil War years, after 1865, the U.S. is gaining an unprecedented international political and economic status. There's a new generation of art patrons, Northerners, who have money to invest in art, having made their fortunes in the war. With this new wealth, Americans are building mansions and are eager to fill them with paintings by old masters and contemporary academics. But there's a new technique in town, Impressionism. They make their debut in 1874 in Paris. It's a new type of genre art. It's a reaction to the neoclassicism, romanticism, and realism that had really dominated all the art world in the early 19th century. What is this new technique? All of this is made possible by the invention of paint in tubes, actually invented by an American, and the portable easel. The railroad also plays a part, offering cheap transportation for artists to get to the seashore or countryside to paint outdoors. So that's the whole focus. It's en plein air, outdoor, spontaneous studies of light and color. Optical mixing is the new rule of the game now. Mixing light and color, rapid brushwork, this painting en plein air, the beginning of modernism in painting. Europe, particularly Paris, is still the center of the art world. That would change later in the early 20th century. American artists wanted to paint in a way that appealed to their newfound patronage in this side of the Atlantic. That means learning about the new styles and movements in Europe. So there's a new wave of American art students flocking to Europe, and they're going to be exposed to this new way of looking at art called Impressionism. The French themselves ridiculed the Impressionistic movement. Critics and elites called it infantile and a mere impression of its subject matter, but the name stuck. The initial American reaction to French Impressionism is one of disdain as well, and it begins to lose its radical edge and be accepted on both sides of the Atlantic by the 1880s. Photography opens the door to modern art in a couple of important ways. It's coming into its own. Remember how it gained prominence during our own Civil War. Photography now is really emerging as a tool for realists, but it also serves as a liberating force for impressionists and an emerging modern art. There's no longer the pressure to have to portray an image realistically in paint. We now have the camera for that purpose. Connecticut artist J. Alden Weir started out in the realist style, as we can see here in his still life with roses. He was so devoted to the realist movement that Weir joined most French critics in his disdain for the new impressionistic movement. He wrote to his parents in 1877 after seeing the third group exhibition in Paris. He says, quote, "I never in my life saw more horrible things. They do not observe drawing or form, but give you an impression of what they call nature. It was worse than the Chamber of Horrors." But later, inspired by Japanese woodblock prints, he saw the light, literally, and converted to Impressionism. By 1891, Weir had reconciled his earlier misgivings about Impressionism and adopted the style as his own, demonstrating a tendency for a lighter palette of pastel colors and broken brushwork like that of the French painters. You can see the beginnings of this in The Red Bridge, shown here. This is his best-known painting. It captures the severe industrial form of a new iron truss bridge covered with red priming paint over a river in Connecticut. It's a relatively conservative brand of Impressionism with fundamentally solid forms and a restrained veneer of broken brushwork, but it's still a marked departure from his earlier realist style. In 1893, the American Art Association grouped his works together with other American and French Impressionists, including Claude Monet. Such a prestigious event meant that the art world had taken notice of the American brand of Impressionism. Born in Cincinnati, John Henry Twachtman received his first art training there. Like many of his contemporaries, he then studied in Europe, mainly in Munich and Venice. His landscapes from this time exhibit the loosely brushed, shadowy technique taught at Munich that became known as tonalism. The German school tended to use a more somber palette than the French. Twachtman returned briefly to the US and then studied in Paris. His paintings shifted toward the soft gray and green tonalist style. His greatest masterpiece during this time was Arc la Bataille. It had shades of Japanese woodblock prints and Whistler's nocturnes that we looked at last time. Here's another lovely work by Twachtman. By the 1880s, the center of the art world had shifted from Munich to Paris. Twachtman abandoned his German training and sought a fresh approach in France. This painting, Springtime, was done in Normandy. It was considered quite radical in its time and shows Twachtman's absorption of several styles. We see aspects of contemporary French painting, the flattened spaces practiced by Whistler, and shades of Japanese prints. It was an era of constant experimentation for artists like Twachtman. Twachtman eventually bought a farm in Connecticut near his friend, J. Alden Weir, and he found inspiration there. The two artists often painted together outdoors in the same way that Monet and Renoir were painting together in France at the time. Like his friend Weir, Twachtman also exhibited with Monet at one point. He became known for his delicate touch and provocative, serene moments as subject matter. Sadly, he died suddenly at the age of 49 of a brain aneurysm. Here's another lovely work by Twachtman where you can definitely see all those influences, German, French, Japanese, come together in a New England setting. By the late 1880s, Twachtman was a successful artist commuting into New York City to teach while fulfilling his painting commissions, but he relished his days at his rural home in Connecticut with his family. This was his main residence and studio. He often painted the surrounding landscape, especially the brook and waterfall in his backyard. Twachtman's close vantage point in this scene suggests his love of and absorption in nature, while the palette and lively brushwork signal his growing affiliation with the Impressionists. He executed dozens of paintings of a small waterfall on his property, capturing the scene in different seasons and times of day. Who does this practice remind you of? Think of Monet, with his series of haystacks, houses of parliament, and his obsession with water lilies, painting them repeatedly in the last 30 years of his life. Paul Cézanne did the same thing in his multiple depictions of Mont Saint-Victoire. Vincent van Gogh was obsessed with sunflowers. It's all about the study of light and its effects on the subject matter. This was more important than the subject matter itself or any narrative. This was the main tenet of Impressionism and why it was considered so revolutionary. Now let's move on to perhaps the best known of the American Impressionists. Born in Dorchester, Massachusetts, Childe Hassam worked in a wood engraver's shop in Boston. He later led a successful career as an illustrator for various magazines and books. Then he visited Paris. It's his turning point and his inspiration. He lived there for 3 years in the late 1880s and actually worked at one point with Mary Cassatt, an American Impressionist living in Paris. Hassam won a bronze medal at the Paris Exposition of 1889. On seeing the artwork in Paris, he remarked, quote, "The American section has convinced me forever of the capability of Americans to claim a school. An artist should paint his own time and treat nature as he feels it, not repeat the same stupidities of his predecessors. The men who have made success today are the men who have gotten out of the rut." End quote. Hassam had no real contact with French Impressionists, but he did take over Renoir's former studio, and he found some of Renoir's oil sketches left behind there. He said, "I do not know anything about Renoir or care anything about Renoir. I looked at these experiments in pure color and saw it was exactly what I was trying to do myself." Hassam created an enormous body of work during his career, more than 4,000 paintings. In the 1890s, Americans were enthralled with and intimidated by life during the Industrial Revolution. They were rediscovering their colonial past and there was a wave of nostalgia for a simpler time in America. His scenes of unkept gardens a la Breton added to the popularity of Hassam's garden paintings. This series was done in a friend's garden on Appledore Island off the coast of New Hampshire. Notice the red poppies? This is very reminiscent of Monet's and Renoir's red poppies. Here are some more examples of Hassam's work from Appledore Island. Beautiful sunlit scenes with the wispy, loose brushstrokes typical of the Impressionist style. In 1889, Hassam returns home from Europe and settles in New York City. He absolutely falls in love with the city. This painting, very American in its subject matter, features the fashionable Fifth Avenue that was traveled at that time by horse-drawn carriages and trolleys. It's one of the artist's favorite paintings, and he exhibited it several times. Hassam skillfully uses a distinctive dark palette of blacks and browns, normally considered forbidden colors by strict Impressionists, to create a winter urban panorama, which critics at the French paper Le Figaro praised for its, quote, American character. Hassam saw New York City as a setting of beauty and excitement comparable to Paris and its fashionable neighborhoods along Fifth Avenue. It shows the elegant side of New York life, and Hassam uses his work to equate it to the more elegant European capitals. This marks a subtle difference between Hassam and the French Impressionists. In general, the French painters did more seasides, more rural and garden scenes. Hassam believed urban scenes provided their own unique atmosphere and light, and were as picturesque as any seaside scene. The challenge for urban Impressionists, however, was how to capture a scene that was constantly and rapidly changing with pedestrian and carriage movement. Getting down a complete impression in oil was next to impossible. To compensate, Hassam would find a suitable location, make sketches of the components of his planned painting, and then return to the studio to construct a total impression that was actually a composite of smaller scenes. So, to be honest, his brand of Impressionism was not as spontaneous as the French. The Washington Arch on the left recalls the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. This arch was built to commemorate the centennial of George Washington's inauguration, so it's a relatively new structure when Hassam paints it in 1890. Although he employed an asymmetrical design and light palette as favored by the French Impressionists, those predecessors of his, Hassam, like most of his American counterparts, preferred not to sacrifice structure and solid form to the fragmented effects of broken color. He's inserted a street cleaner, several pedestrians, a carriage, all identifiable, but he still captures a genteel and sunny, picturesque world. This painting is actually the view from Hassam's studio window. At the top of the painting, you can make out the structure on the 6th Avenue elevated train station, now long gone. What dominates the painting is, of course, the American flags. They're huge and colorful against the drab gray, black, white, and beige that makes up most of the painting. They're probably larger in the painting than they were in real life because Hassam was declaring his support for America's involvement in World War I. From 1916 to 1919, Hassam painted almost 30 canvases highlighting the American flags that hung along New York streets, especially Fifth Avenue. His flag paintings are symbols of patriotic feelings in the U.S. during World War I and are important examples of American Impressionism. They were also promoted to sell savings bonds for the war effort. With French Impressionistic paintings, they're characterized by their application of paint to the canvas in unblended colors using short, broken strokes to create an impression of people and objects rather than painting them in realistic detail. It was more about creating the atmosphere and the play of light for the French. Hassam's primary focus would forever continue to be humanity in motion, another distinction from the French movement. There's more bustle in his urban scenes. And here we see a close-up of his street scene. Flags in city streets had been a favorite subject of French Impressionists even 40 years earlier. Monet, Pissarro, Manet all painted Parisian streets decked with banners, but you can hardly read them. They're just patriotic emblems made with textured strokes. Hassam had a different purpose with his flag paintings. He wanted his flags to be entirely legible as flags because he was constructing images of American patriotism and Allied cooperation. His symbolism had to come through loud and clear. They're generally densely painted with a creamy impasto that stresses their presence, especially with the long vertical stripes of the American flag. The buildings behind are usually vague, as are the people in the traffic. Here, it's the flags that dominate. The flatness of the paintings also almost makes them abstract, giving them a more modern feel. It's Celebration Day here on the left, the end of World War I. The tall buildings are completely covered with flags. It's hard to recognize people below. A silvery sky hangs overhead, and we see three enormous Red Cross banners almost ascending. Unlike early Renaissance painters, Impressionists on both sides of the Atlantic favored asymmetrical composition, cropped figures, and plunging perspectives in their works in order to create a more impressionistic view of the subject. They also, as a group, used broken brushstrokes and practiced that thick application of impasto, applying paint in thick textural layers. Even in this two-dimensional image, we can see those characteristics in this painting by Hassam. American Impressionists like Hassam tended to use pure color straight from the tubes to make the works even more vibrant. European Impressionists, in general, painted tranquil scenes of landscapes or the lower and middle classes. American Impressionists focused on landscapes like the European Impressionists, but unlike their European counterparts, American Impressionists painted scenes that depicted the upper class in an effort to show off America's economic prowess. The Impressionists also focused on capturing modern life as they knew it in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Think of Monet's depiction of steam locomotives, Caillebottes, and Hassam's bustling street scenes, and you'll notice here in the background of the mill pond, towering smokestacks as a tribute to the country's growing industrial might. The canvas is visually divided in half, with the left side being tranquil and bucolic, the right half representing commerce and industry. Look at this lovely still life by Childe Hassam. Note the deliberate, expressive cross-hatching of pears and the tablecloth. And then take a look here at this detail from a still life done by Vincent van Gogh in 1887, over 30 years earlier. Notice the similarities in technique and palette. This would suggest at least an awareness of post-impressionism trends in Europe that were starting to catch on in the States. Painters like Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin had considerable influence on this side of the Atlantic with painters like Hassam. In the latter part of his life, we truly see this post-impressionist tendency in Hassam. Look at this lovely painting, A Long Island Garden. Note the thick impasto layering of paint. This is very Van Gogh. Also, notice the water lilies, very Monet of him. And this was painted at the same time Monet was spending his later years obsessed with painting water lilies at his estate in Giverny. Finally, one more sweet little painting from Childe Hassam. I just saw this work at the Denver Art Museum a couple weeks ago and had to include it here. In spite of Hassam's affinity for cityscapes and depictions of bustling urban American life, this one almost seems as if it's paying homage to the idyllic French impressionistic landscape with its dappled walkway and spring blossoms. In 1898, a group of 10 artists formally united to exhibit their work as a unified group. We see them depicted here. John Henry Twachtman, J. Alden Weir, and Childe Hassam were the founders and driving forces behind the organization. William Merritt Chase, who we'll meet in a moment, would join the group upon the death of Twachtman. Like their French counterparts, these American artists were dissatisfied with the conservatism of the American art establishment, which recognized neoclassicism and realism as the only acceptable art styles. So they set about to create their own exhibition society that valued originality, imagination, and exhibition quality, much like the Salon des Refusés had done in Paris. The 10, as they were called, achieved popular and critical success. This was all part of the tradition of artists forming new groups in reaction to a lack of support from existing artist groups. The National Academy of Design and the Society of American Artists were started in this way, so artists could meet and exhibit their work as a collective. Whistler, that American painter living and creating to much success in England, was asked to join the group, but he declined. As the members of the Ten began to die off, the group eventually disappeared and was replaced by a new movement with a more modern style. So let's move on now to William Merritt Chase. Born in Indiana, he studied art in New York City and Munich. Chase learned painting directly and spontaneously, retouching as little as possible. That's a very impressionistic trait. By the time he returned home from his 6 years in Europe, Chase had developed a real personal flair and style. He appeared as a sophisticated cosmopolitan, but he was a devoted family man. He and his wife raised 8 children. He also gained a reputation as a brilliant teacher. Georgia O'Keeffe and Edward Hopper were among his later students. Chase was known as a natural dandy. He wore spats and a top hat, a cutaway coat, and a neck scarf drawn through a jeweled ring. He used to saunter down Fifth Avenue with a pair of Russian wolfhounds on a leash. Just try and ignore a spectacle like that. He had a spectacular studio where he entertained often with the help of a manservant dressed as an African prince. Very dramatic. Chase became one of New York City's most fashionable portraitists. He was a big admirer of James McNeill Whistler. They met in 1885 in London. Chase believed Whistler was a modern Velázquez. Here's a photo of the two of them from that time. Whistler was famous for having a tuft of white hair among his wild dark curls. You can see it here. Chase highlights it in his full-length portrait of the artist. I chose this painting because it illustrates Chase's complete mastery of the impressionistic palette and the capturing of sunlight. Notice how he highlights the patches of light filtering through the treetops. This is very much like something Renoir or Monet would be doing in France at the time. The poppy red pigment is also a trademark hue on the impressionistic palette. Chase often used his wife and daughters as models. The practice of showing the middle class or bourgeois class in leisure activities, everyday life, and rituals is another innovative aspect of impressionistic painting. On both sides of the Atlantic, those leisurely pastimes often revolved around boating or the seaside. In this example, Chase shows his mastery of capturing reflected light on the water's surface. We don't even see Mrs. Chase's face that clearly, but that's okay, because the painting is more about the light on the water than it is about her. Here's a beautiful genre painting a la Renoir or Monet. Once again, one of the reasons Impressionism was so revolutionary was the fact that it didn't focus on historical events, biblical scenes, or powerful personalities as the more traditional artistic styles had done. Rather, it dared depict scenes from everyday life, like this scene of families at the seashore. Look at the beautiful and intentional balance of color as depicted by Chase, with the yellow and red umbrellas against the blue sky and water. Chase's creativity declined in his later years, especially as modern art took hold in America, but he continued to paint and teach into the 1910s. Here's one of his later works showing full impressionist tendencies in his loose and sketchy brushwork. As we turn the century mark, art is now starting to move in a new direction with the new century. Even Impressionism would fall away as a more avant-garde movement takes hold. But first, here's a lovely work by Edmund Tarbell, another one of the 10. Dappled sunlight, touches of that signature poppy red, a casual scene of domestic activity, and the gorgeous layering of light and shadow in the textiles. Notice all the hues depicted in the white dresses: blue, gray, cream, taupe. They're hardly simple swaths of white here. Again, the real subject here is not so much the young women as the play of light on fabric. This is Children in Woods by Frank Benson, another member of the 10. Despite the three girls pictured, this is not really a portrait, but rather a study of light on the hair and the dresses. One of the faces is seen only in profile, another is unfocused, and the third girl has her back to us. So this is simply as casual as a photograph. From the 1890s through the 1910s, American Impressionism flourished in art colonies. These were loosely affiliated groups of artists who lived and worked together and shared a common aesthetic vision. Beginning in New England, art colonies tended to form in small towns that provided affordable living, abundant scenery nearby for painting, and relatively easy access to large cities like New York or Boston or Providence, where artists could sell their work. Some of the most important American Impressionistic artists gathered at Cos Cob and Old Lyme, Connecticut, in New Hope, Pennsylvania on the Delaware River, Brown County, Indiana, and even in California in places like Carmel and Laguna Beach. This photo shows a colony on eastern Long Island that thrived under the influence of William Merritt Chase. Finally, we cannot talk about American Impressionism without talking about Mary Cassatt, even if she did spend most of her artistic career in France. Cassatt was born into an upper middle class family in Pittsburgh. Her mother was an accomplished woman, an intellectual who spoke French. She's shown here in Mary's portrait of her reading a French paper, Le Figaro. Many believe Mary got her ability and her determination from her. Cassatt studied first at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. She then traveled to Paris, where one of her early, more traditionally styled paintings was accepted at the Paris Salon in 1868, but the Franco-Prussian War interrupted her studies, so she returned home and then went back to Europe 3 years later. While in Italy, she studied Correggio and Parmigianino, specifically his Madonna and Child paintings, so make note of that for later. She also spent time studying the works of Velázquez in Spain, Rubens in Belgium, and Hals in Holland. After a year of travel, she settled in Paris in 1874 and began to show regularly at the Salon. At that 1874 Salon, a certain French artist would take note of her work, an observation that would have life-altering consequences for Cassatt. That French artist was none other than Edgar Degas. This is the portrait by Mary Cassatt that Degas saw at the Salon. It's not especially remarkable on its own merits, but Degas saw something in it that connected to him. At Degas' invitation, Mary soon becomes the only American officially associated with the group of innovative painters who came to be known as Impressionists. She exhibits in 4 of the 8 exhibitions put on by these réfugiés between 1879 and 1886. Under their influence, Cassatt revised her technique, composition, use of color and light, and shows admiration for works of the French avant-garde, especially Degas and Manet. Cassatt later told her biographer, quote, "It was at that moment that Degas persuaded me to send no more to the Salon and to exhibit with his friends in the group of Impressionists. I accepted with joy. At last I could work with complete independence without concerning myself with the eventual judgment of a jury. I already knew who were my true masters. I admired Manet, Courbet, and Degas. I hated conventional art. I began to live." Unquote. Degas becomes Cassatt's chief mentor. He provided criticism of her work, offered advice on technique, and encouraged her experiments in printmaking. He also accompanied her to the Louvre to study the old masters. Remember, at this time, women were not allowed to enter public places like the Louvre unchaperoned. Like Degas, Cassatt was chiefly interested in figure composition. In the late 1870s and 80s, the subjects of her works were her family members, especially her sister Lydia, the theater, and the opera. Taking tea was a daily ritual for the upper classes. The model here is her sister Lydia, who had moved to Paris along with their parents in 1877. She often posed for Mary. This painting received critical acclaim at the 1881 Impressionist exhibition. Lydia in a Loge, on the right, is a bright and luminous painting with lots of color, showing fluent brushwork, and has a modern subject, the Paris Theater. It placed her immediately well within the Impressionist group, recalling similar paintings by Renoir. This painting shows the hallmark of Impressionism, showing contemporary society going about their daily activities. Here we see a modern woman, Cassatt's sister Lydia, enjoying herself at the theater. She's not a saint or a goddess or anyone of historical importance. It simply depicts a night out in Paris, humanizing women in ways that male artists had not yet explored. Besides the quick brushstrokes that were indicative of Impressionist paintings, Cassatt also implemented the tipped perspective that was common in many of Degas' paintings, like his ballet dancers. This caused the viewers to never be quite able to figure out where in the painting they would be standing if they were present in the scene. Cassatt was known for several of her themes centered on women. She gives us a noble treatment of women, no doubt going back to her intellectual mother's influence. Here are some of her reader paintings. The women are mostly unidentified. It's the activity of reading a book or newspaper that takes prominence. On a balcony at the bottom right, again showcases the artist's sister Lydia reading a newspaper. It proclaims modernity and intellectual curiosity regarding current events that was not in a woman's purview at the time. The women in Cassatt's paintings rarely look out of the picture or meet the gaze of the viewer. They are absorbed in their own activities. That's really remarkable for the late 19th century. Even though they're usually occupied with more bourgeois occupations, such as crocheting, embroidering, knitting, taking tea, etc., it's still remarkable and ennobling. The bulk of Cassatt's work features women. She has only 3 known portraits of men, and those are sketches of family members. Again, the social conventions of the times, when it was considered unsuitable for a woman to be alone in the studio with a male model, dictated those limitations. Most women were also denied access to the male nude in studio classes. Despite her friendship with Degas and other artists and her familiarity with her retired father or brothers, she lived apart from the close community of male artists and the daily contact they had in business, professions, or government. The positive side of this is that it helped spawn Cassatt's specialty, the mother and child theme, which she treated with warmth and naturalness in her paintings and pastels. Cassatt knew the world of women, the drawing room, and childbearing as few men in that period could have done. A contemporary critic in 1881 said, quote, "For the first time, thanks to Miss Cassatt, I have seen the likenesses of ravishing children, quiet bourgeois scenes painted with a delicate and charming tenderness. Furthermore, only a woman can paint infancy. There's a special feeling that a man cannot achieve. Only a woman can pose a child, dress it, adjust the pins without pricking themselves. This is family life painted with distinction and with love. She achieved something none of our other painters could express, the happy contentment, the quiet friendliness of an interior." Cassatt was constantly experimenting with materials and styles. Here we see various aqua tints and etchings from 1890 and 91. She was an enthusiastic proponent of Japonisme, which was all the rage in Western art at that time, as we've seen. Flattened space, simple line definition, a lack of mass, a lack of background, and subdued palette. She applies that beautifully to her signature theme of mother and child. This lovely genre scene is based on the everyday bathing of a child, a moment that is special by not being special. Like Degas, Cassatt preferred unposed, asymmetrical compositions. Here, the circular shapes of the figures' heads, the basin in the pitcher, as well as the striped pattern of the woman's dress, animate the portrait of a woman bathing a child. Notice Cassatt's unusual vantage point from above. This subject also shows her interest in Japanese woodblock prints, extremely popular in France at the time. The theme of women caring for children appeared frequently in Cassatt's art during and after the 1880s. In rendering this subject, the artist relied on keen observation rather than idealization, yet she still depicts the scene with great intimacy. The woman's gestures, one firm hand securing the child in her lap, the other gently caressing its small foot, are both natural and emblematic, communicating her tender concern for the child's well-being. The two figures gaze in the same direction, looking together at their paired reflection in the basin of water. Many of Cassatt's paintings, pastels, and prints depict children being bathed, dressed, read to, held, or nursed, and reflect the most advanced 19th century ideas about raising children. After 1870, French scientists and physicians encouraged mothers to care for their children themselves, instead of having a wet nurse or a nanny. and they suggested modern approaches to health and personal hygiene, including regular bathing, which was a novel idea at the time. In the face of several cholera epidemics in the mid-1880s, bathing was encouraged not only as a remedy for body odors, but also as a preventative measure against disease. This amusing painting is Vintage Cassatt, Vintage Impressionism. The viewer is dropped abruptly into the space because the frame cuts off the edges of the armchairs. We're also blocked from seeing the tops of the background sofas. Such devices owe much to Cassatt's friend Degas. In fact, a recent cleaning and restoration of this painting and the use of infrared technology confirm that Degas actually contributed some of the brushstrokes to this painting. All of this functions to create a pictorial structure that conveys incompleteness, awkwardness, playfulness, and disproportions of scale. The child sprawls languidly and inelegantly on the chair, and that gives us an instant grasp of her attitude and personality. Compare this to a formal portrait of a child. This was considered very modern art at the time, and it shows the influence again of photography in capturing that candid, spontaneous moment. The collaboration of Cassatt and Degas lasted many years. They had a lot in common. They shared similar tastes in art and literature. They both came from affluent backgrounds. They both had studied painting in Italy. They stayed independent, neither one ever marrying. Degas introduced Cassatt to pastel and engraving, both of which Cassatt quickly mastered. For her part, Cassatt was instrumental in helping Degas sell his paintings and promoting his reputation in America. She bought one of his paintings, one of his ballet dancers, the first ever French Impressionist painting to be introduced in America. Cassatt's failing eyesight severely curtailed her work after 1900. She gave up printmaking in 1901, and in 1904 stopped painting altogether. She died at her country home in her adopted country of France in 1926, the same year that Monet passed away. Some American art colonies remained vibrant centers of Impressionism into the 1920s. However, Impressionism in America lost its cutting-edge status by 1913 when a historic exhibition of modern art took place at the 69th Regiment Armory Building in New York City. The Armory Show, as it came to be called, heralded a new painting style regarded as more in touch with the increasingly fast-paced and chaotic world, especially with the threat of World War I and then the Great Depression that followed. The U.S. would eventually replace France as the center of the art world with the advent of various avant-garde movements taking root here, such as abstract expressionism between the two wars. With the invention of the elevator and the mass production of nails, American architecture would also lead the way in the creation of that new icon of American prowess and ingenuity, the skyscraper. But it's the 19th century that will be remembered for the development of a new art aesthetic that reflects the founding, the settlement, and the growing prominence of the American melting pot. I hope you've enjoyed this series on American art during the 19th century. It's my hope that it sparked your interest in the topic, spurring you to do your own investigation into this exciting era in our history. Thanks for joining me on this journey.